Yeah, so I'm going to talk about the main mechanisms underlying controlling working memory, and also in more applied tasks like decision making. So just a sort of an outline to my talk. I'm going to give just some basic background to working memory and executive functions. Sorry, but I'm not going to define whether it's short-term memory. People have different preferences for what they call it. I'll talk a little bit about some work in the neuroanatomy of working memory, and then I'm going to talk about some work I've done on how we integrate different types of information in our working memory, and I'll show evidence from fMRI and EEG. And then I'm going to talk about some work I've been doing more recently, which has looked at neural connectivity and how that relates to working memory and reasoning ability. And then also some more applied stuff into how different working memory brain regions are recruited when we have to make decisions in a kind of consumer situation. So some background. Working memory is basically the ability to hold and use information that is no longer physically available to us. So we actually do this all the time. It's kind of essential for our daily life. Things like reasoning and decision making and action planning, they all involve some kind of manipulation of information in our minds. Working memory's got a really limited capacity, so we can't hold very much in our memory at any one time. And it also involves control processes that kind of prevent stored information from getting lost, so protect it from distraction and kind of supervise, like switch between different tasks in our memory. So just to give an example, following directions requires maintaining a sequence of directions while updating where you are in that sequence and ignoring distracting information from the environment. So this is just like an everyday example of how we use our working memory all the time. And there's been a few kind of theoretical models put forward of working memory. The best one is, the best known one is the Babbly one, which conceptualizes working memory as like a separate cognitive system, which has separate stores for different types of information, and they're kind of ruled over by a central executive, which basically controls how information goes into these stores. And so he distinguishes between different types of information in working memory. So there's a separation between visual working memory and verbal working memory. So in theory they can operate in parallel. And within the visual domain, which I'm going to focus on here, it's been subdivided into working memory for kind of object-based information or spatial information. So in neuropsychology, there's been like double dissociations between patients who are impaired at spatial tasks, but they're fine at tasks that require working memory for kind of visual identity or patterns. And then the opposite has been observed in other patients. And also in healthy people, people can do dual tasks, so they can perform two tasks at the same time, provided that they tap into the different systems. So if one is visual and one is spatial, then they can perform those tasks at the same time without any detriment to performance on either task. So there's evidence from behaviour that there are definitely domain-specific stores, and this model kind of focuses on storage. Some other models focus more on the kind of processes that are involved in working memory. So they kind of see working memory as just a functional state rather than a separate system. And so it's just what you're currently attending to, and they focus on the different kind of processes that you apply to these representations. But the models aren't mutually exclusive of each other. They just take a different emphasis on aspects of working memory. And I've tried to consider both storage and processing in my work. As I said, there seems to be different subsystems for different types of information. And this has been shown to be true in an anatomical sense as well. So as well as being functionally different, there does seem to be an anatomical separation of different types of information in working memory. As probably most of you know, in vision, we have a dorsal and ventral visual stream. So the dorsal stream is for like spatial information, and the ventral stream is for kind of vision information. And this has been shown to continue into more higher level areas that are involved in cognitive processes like working memory. So into kind of frontal regions, we see distinctions between kind of spatial and object information. So in this example, it's faces and locations. But also, there does seem to be kind of domain general regions, so regions that don't really care about the content, they care more about the type of process that's being carried out. Executive functions like inhibition or switching between tasks or updating working memory seem to involve these kind of parietal regions and also prefrontal regions. In this example, this seems to involve left parietal and right prefrontal, and there does generally seem to be the right prefrontal region seems to be more involved in kind of the type of process as opposed to the kind of content. So there might be some laterality differences as well, but they're not very well understood. So what I wanted to do was to see how do these different regions that are involved in storage and processing, how do they kind of work together in working memory? So how can we integrate information that's being held in these kind of separate domain-specific stores? Working memory is a complex task, so it requires processing throughout the brain in lots of different areas, but at some point all of this information needs to be integrated together. So integration is kind of like one of the sort of executive functions of working memory. And the models kind of, both models that I discussed previously of working memory don't really specify how information can be integrated, and both of them seem to specify that there's this kind of extra store, kind of a temporary store where you combine information, so it holds both types of information from different domains, but they're pretty vague on it. I worked with some colleagues initially on this, and we based our task on some behavioural work which showed that spatial information, so like the orientation of objects and the colour of the object, could be maintained in working memory in a dual task. So you could do both of these tasks in working memory. So they had to like mix together the colour or the orientation and then match it to the test stimulus. They could do that in parallel. They could do the colour and the spatial task in parallel with no significant impairment relative to the harder of the two single tasks. But when both tasks, so when they had two spatial tasks to do, so like location and orientation, they were significantly worse at the dual task. So two spatial tasks kind of interfere with each other, but a colour and a spatial task don't. So we created a kind of modified version of this task. So basically, people see two coloured shapes, and they have to try and find the average shape in this delay period, and then match it to the test stimulus. So they have to say yes or no whether this matches the test stimulus. And the type of attribute that's important is indicated at the beginning by a letter, so they have to attend to either the orientation or the colour, or in the conjunction task they have to do the task based on both the colour and the orientation. So they only answer yes if this matches the average colour and the average orientation. So they have to integrate both types of information in their working memory. And this was what I was really interested in this experiment. What's the brain doing when it has to integrate information from both streams? So we used fMRI to find the specific regions that were involved in the task. and also to look at the kind of approximate timing of the involvement of those regions. So fMRI is not very good at looking at fine grained timing information, but we thought we could at least get an idea of roughly when different regions were active. So these are a little bit difficult to interpret. Basically, they're flat maps. So what they are is the brain has kind of been flattened out, and so it's like a two-dimensional representation. This is the front of the right hemisphere, and this is the back, and then this is the front of the left hemisphere, and this is the back. So just to kind of orient you to what you're seeing. And so regions in red were more active in the colour condition. So you can see the left inferior frontal gyrus, and there was a small area in the right occipital cortex, so like a visual area at the back of the brain. For orientations, parietal cortex in the right hemisphere, and also superior frontal region bilaterally here. So these are showing the classic kind of dorsal ventral divide in working memory in kind of high level areas between visual and spatial information, which is what we expected. What's interesting is that in the conjunction task, you see in these graphs, these areas show kind of intermediate activity. So, which is strange because you're doing both colour and orientation, but it doesn't seem to be an additive thing. So it doesn't seem to be that the regions are quite as active as they would be in the single task. And I think this relates to a kind of biased competition account where they're kind of mutually suppressing one another, but I'll come back to that a bit later. So what's really interesting, what we were really interested in, is the regions that were active during the conjunction task. So this is regions that responded more in the conjunction task when people had to do both colour and orientation. And so you can see in the right prefrontal areas, there's increased activity in both like dorsal and ventral regions. And also a region in the left parietal cortex was active. And then finally, there was a region that was less active in the conjunction task. So it was kind of suppressed in the conjunction task relative to the single tasks. And this was in the temporal occipital cortex bilaterally. This is like a kind of visual association area, a relatively early visual area. So to try and understand this conjunction task activity a bit more, we first of all looked at the time courses. So this shows the time course with the activity in each region, and like I said, it's just a kind of rough time course because it's fMRI. But the frontal cortex seems to be active earlier, so this difference between the conjunction task and the other tasks seems to come out earlier. And then the parietal cortex shows increased conjunction task activity, but later on. And then finally, this suppression seems to come afterwards. The suppression of visual areas comes later on. So we took these time courses and put them into a structural equation model. So what this does is it kind of tells the kind of causal influences that one region has on another region. So how activity in one region influences activity in another region. And so we looked at what gave it. So we put in all the plausible combinations of models between these different regions. And what came out was we had some good fitting models. So this one's the best fitting model. And then we also had some poor fitting models. And so we looked at what seemed to be the features of good fitting models. So first of all, one feature of a good fitting model is having this kind of two-way pathway between dorsolateral and ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. So there's like a connection between the dorsal and ventral stream in the prefrontal cortex. What was essential for a good model is having a connection between from frontal areas to parietal cortex. If that was missing, then that gave a poor model. And then finally, it was essential to have a connection from parietal cortex to the visual areas. So this kind of tells us that the prefrontal cortex seems to be exerting control over the other areas via the parietal cortex, and it's the parietal cortex that sends the biasing signals back to the visual areas. So just to kind of summarise from this experiment, it seems that the prefrontal cortex seems to play a role in working memory in enhancing task-relevant information in the domain-specific regions and suppressing the irrelevant information. And so this gives us, in the regions that are specialised for processing those kinds of information, this gives us this intermediate activity, because there's kind of mutual inhibition between both representations, because they both need to be active. In the conjunction task, we see this greater activity in the right prefrontal cortex. And so this is probably because more resources are needed for coordinating the task of sending biasing signals to the other regions. And what's interesting is we see this increased activity in parietal cortex, which we think might be a site for integrating information. So it might correspond to this kind of abstract temporary multimodal store that the models have suggested. And actually, evidence from neuropsychology kind of backs this up. So patients who have lesions in the parietal area do seem to have impairments in binding features together in vision. So this could be a site for integrating information in working memory. So I wanted to look at this a little bit more to see, well, if the parietal cortex is important, what does it actually do? How does it actually integrate information into a kind of single representation? So I looked at theories of binding in visual perception, and so one idea is that when we view an image, we kind of see a whole image, because the different features of the image are bound together by neurons firing in synchrony. And so neurons that are like sensitive to spatial information will fire in synchrony with the neurons that are sensitive to like identity, and that's how an object, those features of an object will become like bound together. This in visual perception, this has been associated with quite high frequency neural firing in visual areas, so in the gamma frequency range. And yeah, just a couple of examples. So when these can be grouped quite easily, you see this increased gamma activity. So this is like frequency along the y-axis here. And so this is as these stimuli are presented, this is the time the stimuli being presented. So when stimuli can be visually grouped, you see this increased gamma activity. And here, you see this like, when this illusory object appears, compared to a condition where these circles are oriented away, so you don't see this kind of illusory triangle. We see this increased gamma activity here as well for perceiving this kind of whole object.
Sorry, just cool. Maybe else leave, it's all good stuff.
Is there something like that?
It's gone the wrong way, you won't get out that way.
So yeah, I wanted to see whether integrating representations in visual working memory also involves gamma activity. When you're not actually perceiving these representations, when they're just held in your memory. So I used MEG to look at this. This is similar to EEG in that it's a direct measure of neural firing, but it's got better spatial resolution. So the advantage that this gave me is that I could look at this high frequency activity, but I could also try and find where it's coming from in the brain. So I could see if parietal cortex is involved and see what frequencies seem to be causing this activity. So the task was the same. People had to manipulate the colour, the orientation, or both the colour and the orientation of these stimuli, and they had to make their decision based on both the colour and the orientation of the stimulus. And then what I did data was I did a sort of source analysis, which is called a beamformer analysis. What this does is if you take an MRI scan of each participant and then kind of co-register it to all the different MEG sensors, what you can do is at each location, so like in each location of the MRI scan, you can estimate what activity would be produced on the surface by looking at the data covariance matrix, so seeing what the covariances are between each of the sensors you've got on the surface of the head. So this can be used to estimate how much each region of the brain is contributing to that signal. So for each brain region, you can get a kind of time course of the activity of that region. So, so I was able to do the frequency analysis by using these, what we call virtual sensors. So they're actually throughout the brain. So I can see which areas of the brain were responsible for these activities. And so what I did was analyse the frequency in the delay interval relative to the baseline period before the stimuli appear. So basically I was looking at power in different frequency bands in this interval compared to the baseline. And so now this is superimposed on a template brain. So these are regions that show significantly greater power relative to baseline in the gamma frequency band. So this is 60 to 80 Hertz, and then this is 80 to 100 Hertz. And you can see straight away in the conjunction task there's more gamma activity in left parietal cortex in the conjunction task compared to either of the two single tasks. So this gamma activity does seem to be associated with forming conjunction of information in working memory, and it does seem to be localized strongly to left parietal cortex. So this was significantly greater than either this or this. What's also interesting is that the magnitude of this gamma power correlated with accuracy on the conjunction task. So the more accurate people were on this task, the higher their gamma activity. So it did seem to be associated with actual performance, and the more gamma activity, the better they are at integrating information. And just to kind of look at that in a different way, all the analyses before were on correct trials. When I looked at incorrect trials, they didn't show this left parietal gamma activity. So this is a map of correct minus incorrect. So you can see this region is still there. So this activity was only found for correct trials where they got it right. Oh, and just one more thing. This corresponds quite well with that left parietal region we saw in the fMRI data. So this is just a map of the overlap. So in red, this is the region I've seen in MEG, and then in yellow, in fMRI, and then the region of blue is the overlap between the regions. And obviously, this just shows the surface. They overlap kind of in 3 dimensions. So the actual centres of those areas were quite close, and they were completely different participants in the 2 experiments. So this kind of backs up the data quite nicely, I think. So it shows that this left parietal region is really important for integrating information. So yeah, the second experiment has shown that the mechanism of integrating information in working memory is by synchronised gamma oscillations in this left parietal region. And so this supports the idea that there might be a kind of region for kind of abstract working memory for like integrating information that isn't that comes from different domains. And in support of this, some of the monkey neurophysiology work has shown that the corresponding area in monkeys contains neurons that are selective for both shape and for locations. So it's possible that in this task, the integrated representation could have been formed by both types of neurons oscillating in synchrony to produce this integrated representation of the object. So what I want to go on to talk about now is kind of connectivity between or throughout the whole brain what I've talked about so far is how synchronization within a specific brain region can be associated with working memory, executive functions. But what I'm also interested in is in how the kind of brain functions as a network and how this affects our working memory and our cognitive ability. So we know that working memory involves a really wide network of brain areas. And one of the main ways that information is thought to be transmitted throughout the brain is by synchronized neural activity. And in general, it's thought that lower frequency bands are more likely to be involved in transmitting information across further distances, so between more distant brain areas. So whereas I saw high frequency gamma earlier, that was within a single brain region, and it's more likely that between different brain regions, lower frequencies would be involved for various reasons. One way to look at whether regions are kind of synchronized is to look at whether the phases are synchronized. So in this example here, these two waveforms have the same frequency, and they're also in the same phase. So there's a slight lag between, say, like this and this, but they would show a high level of phase coherence. So this means that they're kind of synchronized. So this is kind of what I'm looking for. So what you can do is you can estimate a kind of network based on how connected different regions are, and this just shows how you can do it. So you can do it structurally with things like DTI, so you can actually look at white matter to get an idea of structural connections. But what I'm interested in is doing it by using time series data like EEG, and this tells you the functional connections of the brain, so how different areas kind of influence one another. And this is usually done just during rest, so when the brain's just in a kind of resting state, when the subject isn't doing any task. So it just gives you an idea of how the brain is kind of connected together. Yeah, so basically you just take the EEG and you look at the coherences between all the different electrodes, and this gives you a kind of map of the correlations, which you can threshold, and then you can get out this network. So yeah, this is just based on phase coherence. Well, why is it interesting? Well, the reason it's interesting is because we can look at kind of traits like what we call reasoning ability, and we can give people like complex tasks and then look at resting state activity and see how this relates to their performance on, say, like tests of fluid intelligence, to see whether the network properties of their brain are related to their kind of level of reasoning ability or fluid intelligence. And so what I'm kind of interested in is in individuals with a high ability, do they have different functional brain networks from individuals who have a low cognitive ability? And there hasn't been very much work on this, and what work there has been is show kind of mixed results. So one study found that if you train people on working memory tasks and look at their resting state EEG before you've trained them and then after you train them, they seem to have a more efficient resting state network afterwards. Whereas other work has shown that when they compared highly educated individuals to low educated individuals as a kind of proxy for kind of intelligence, they found that the more highly educated individuals had less efficient activity, although this was during a task of rest. So there hasn't really been very much work done on this, and I've just started to look at it really. What I did for this experiment was I used Raven's advanced progressive matrices. So these are kind of tests of reasoning. It's kind of sometimes called fluid intelligence. And so I'm just going to shorten it to IQ, although I realise that's probably controversial. And so what I did was tested most of the second year students. This was at Bangor, because they were taking a module in individual differences of personality, so we kind of incorporated this into the module so they had the opportunity to sit IQ test. And then, based on their scores, I selected a kind of group from the top end of the distribution, who I call the high IQ group, and a group from the kind of lower end, or a low IQ group. And I tested them on several different tests of working memory ability, and as you might predict, the high IQ group performed better on most of the tasks that involved kind of working memory control processes, so things like backward, digit span and dot span, various different types of end-back tasks. So end-back tasks are where you have to kind of constantly update your working memory, and dual tasks, they were better at dual tasks as well. So I wanted to see what the brain was actually doing in these people, what were the network properties of their brain when they actually weren't engaged in any task. So we recorded resting EEG with their eyes closed from 64 electrodes, and the dominant frequency was alpha, which you expect from resting EEG. But alpha has also been related to inhibition in different cognitive tasks. So that was kind of why I was interested in looking at alpha. And I used a kind of beamformer analysis again to estimate the source activity in the regions that underlay the electrodes. And then I used a measure of coherence to estimate the connections between these regions. I should point out, I used like a lagged phase coherence, so this only takes into account coherence where there's a slight lag in how they're oscillating. So one's oscillating like that and the other is slightly behind it. And the reason is because they were completely in phase, it could be caused by volume conduction, so it could be that the two sensors are just measuring the same thing, and because voltage is kind of spread out on the scale. So I did try and avoid that in this experiment, and that was also the reason for doing beamformer analysis as well. So it's, the analysis is done in like source space. So I tried to minimise problems that you get with this kind of analysis with like volume conduction. And then I used graph theoretical analysis to look at different properties of the network. So in this type of analysis, the brain regions or the electrodes or whatever you have are called nodes, and the level of coherence between them indicates the strength of the connection between them. And so brain networks are called small well networks, so that means they're not completely random. They have properties like clustering, so some nodes are more strongly connected to like neighbouring nodes, and then there's like pathways between clusters of nodes. So they show like, in general, they show small world properties, and the more stronger the small world properties of the network, the more efficient it's assumed to be. So I looked at these properties in my two groups, and what I found is that a sort of metric that's called the clustering coefficient, which is the number of connections that you have between all the neighbours of a given like electrode. This was higher in the low IQ group compared to the high IQ group. I also found that the path length was shorter in the low IQ group compared to the high IQ group. So the path length is how many connections you need to traverse to get from, say, like one part of the network to another part of the network. So this is kind of it's kind of better if it's shorter. And so yeah, so basically the global efficiency of the network, which indicates how efficient the network is, was higher for people with a low IQ compared to when we had a high IQ. Yeah, basically the low IQ group show a stronger small world network than the high IQ group. So they show a more efficient network at best. So this is kind of surprising. You might expect that the opposite would be true, although there isn't much on this in the literature, and like I said, a lot of it is contradictory. What I suggest is that people who have higher cognitive abilities might just have more neural resources. So when they're at rest, or if they're performing, say, like an easy task, the neural activity can be less efficient. It's possible that in different tasks, and when the task becomes more challenging, it might be the case that people with a higher cognitive ability, if they're at the kind of peak of their ability, might have a more efficient network. And so I need to look at that in other work. The other thing is that, related to that, is that the kind of alpha that you could use when you're just at rest with your eyes closed might be different from the kind of alpha frequency that's produced when you're actually doing a task. So I need to now compare. I do have data from this task when I'm actually doing a task, so I need to compare that to this to try and get a more fuller picture of what's going on. And so the final thing I want to talk about is how we use our working memory in the real world. So the first study I showed you, although kind of experimentally it was quite well controlled, it didn't really use very realistic stimuli. In the real world, we don't really use our working memory to kind of combine the colour and orientation of simple stimuli. We use it to do things like make important decisions, follow directions. So I wanted to devise a more realistic test of working memory. And so one example is in decision making, and particularly in reward-based decision making. So we use our working memory to kind of represent contingencies. So if you do this, you get this reward. So working memory can kind of represent contingencies across time. And it's been shown that people who have limited working memory show more impulsive decision making. Particularly in schizophrenia, schizophrenics are impaired when they are given kind of real-world shopping tasks where they have to complete the kind of shopping list. And so what I wanted to do was see how the brain areas that are involved in working memory, so these like prefrontal and parietal areas that are involved in working memory control, how are they recruited in a kind of more realistic task that involves the kind of decision making that we do in daily life. So I chose a shopping task. And we know that the decision to buy a product kind of involves an interplay between these kind of prefrontal regions that are involved in working memory and also like subcortical regions that are involved in kind of reward-based decision making. But what I wanted to do was to see if I kind of varied the working memory demands of the task while keeping it realistic. Does this affect how prefrontal and parietal areas are recruited in this task? So what I did was I created a shopping task. People were told they were shopping for a party, and they had to get the best offers. And this is a typical example of how we use our working memory. So when we go shopping, we're faced with all these special offers, and we have to make the decision about whether we want to go for this special offer or whether this represents a good offer. And the typical ones are multi-buys. So I included multi-buy offers in this experiment. So they could be good multi-buys. So this is where the price of buying these, like £2 for £3 or whatever was made it cheaper than if you just multiplied the original price by 2. Or there were bad multi-buys where actually if you did the calculations you would discover that actually the multi-buy didn't represent any savings. It was actually more expensive than if you just bought 2 at a normal price. And I varied the complexity of the multi-buy as well, so it was they could buy 2 for a given amount, or 3 for a given amount. So trying to work out the cost of the 3-4 multiplies was obviously more complex and required more working memory input. I also included price discounts, where the price discount was just clearly stated, this is money off, so there was no need for working memory at all, it was just clearly a discount. I included an additional condition, which they just had a special offer text, but there was actually no savings. But there was no way they could see that because it didn't give the original price. So just to kind of show you the images, it looked a bit like this. So they had a realistic image, and the price was realistic. And participants just had to indicate whether or not they wanted to buy it and how many of this item they wanted to buy. And so behaviourally, what we see is quite interesting actually. So I didn't think people would select any of the bad offers, but actually around 30% of bad multi-buys were actually selected. So this is the percentage of the offer type, of each offer type chosen out of the total of that offer type. So people were better at, people could differentiate between good and bad offers, but they still selected a fairly reasonable proportion of bad offers. So they weren't great at doing it. This just shows response times. So they generally took about 4 seconds to make their decision. And they had 10 seconds, so they weren't, it wasn't because they were really rushed, like they were making poor decisions on some of these offers. The other thing that came out is I tested a wide range of people, a wide age range of people, and I quantified the ability to select good over bad offers by subtracting the proportion of bad offers chosen from the proportion of good offers chosen. So basically, 0 is if they couldn't differentiate between good and bad offers at all, or they weren't trying to do the calculations, and 1, a score of 1 would be if they were perfect, and they never chose a bad offer, and they always got all the good offers. So they were working them out, and they could figure out whether it was a good or a bad offer. And so with age, the ability to select the good offers decreased, and this was significant. So the older people were, the less able they were to distinguish or to kind of do the calculations to figure out whether an offer was good or bad. I also did a kind of behavioural flanker task before the shopping experiment. So this was where they just had a simple behavioural task to measure their kind of level of distraction, how distractible they were. So they had to basically they had to respond to the direction of like the central arrow and ignore the items on either side. They had to give a left or right key press depending on the direction of this arrow. And the items on either side could be congruent, or they could be incongruent, or they could be neutral. And yeah, so the target was the central one. And basically, the larger the incongruency effect. So the incongruency effect is the response time on the incongruent condition minus the response time on the neutral condition. And so the larger this effect, the kind of more distractible the person is. And this level of distractibility was also negatively correlated with the ability to select good offers. So the more distractible they were, the worse they were at selecting good offers as well. So this kind of suggests that if they lack inhibitory control, they're less good at actually figuring out what's a good and what's a bad offer. So moving on to the fMRI results. As you would expect, when you compare multi-buys to price discounts, so basically good multi-buys were equivalent to the price discounts, you see that you get an increase in parietal and prefrontal activity. So this is the inferior frontal areas, and this is parietal areas, and these regions are regions of the working memory network, and they show greater activity for working out multi-buys than for deciding whether or not to get an item in a price discount. And this is probably just because the multi-buys obviously place more demands on working memory. So this shows that people are actually using their working memory to compute the cost of these multi-buys. What's really interesting though is when you look at the different types of multi-buy, so you would expect that working memory would be recruited more with the more difficult multi-buys, so when they have to do the 3 for a given price rather than the 2 for multi-buys. But actually it's the opposite. We saw greater activity in these parietal and here these parietal areas and these prefrontal areas. The activity was much greater in the more simple multi-buy condition. And so what this actually seems to suggest is that in a realistic task, people actually don't bother. If the task isn't specifically about a working memory task, and you're not giving them the, you're not telling them, oh, you have to work this out for the task. They actually just let you use their working memory in a realistic task when it becomes more difficult. And actually, what I think is that they're just relying on kind of guesses, so they know that offers are usually good, so they just rely on that and don't bother recruiting their working memory. And another thing that I need to explore more is we also saw when people didn't have to use their working memory, when it was just a discount condition, we see this increase in insular activity. So the insular's associated with emotional processing. I'm not sure yet whether this means that people prefer discounts because they place lower demands on working memory. But it does fit in with some literature that says that people like items more if they had to spend less effort, less kind of mental effort processing them. So I think this could potentially have interesting implications for like advertising or for kind of consumer-based things. So just to summarize, the worse people are at inhibiting irrelevant information, so the worse that their working memory control processes are, the worse they are at making good decisions in a realistic task. And this ability kind of gets worse with age, and this parallels the decrease in working memory ability with age. So we know that working memory gets worse as we age, and this is has been shown to be caused by problems in control of working memory. So older people have worse inhibitory control or the ability to coordinate information in working memory. And so this is probably the cause of the worst decision making with age. But we've shown this now in a realistic task, whereas most other work has shown this in kind of not very realistic working memory tasks. And yeah, this is what I think is quite interesting, is that actually, even though we have working memory ability, we might not always use it. And obviously in more realistic tasks, people use things like heuristics, so like, these are kind of like rules of thumb. So if you see a special offer sign or a multi-buy, you know that represents a discount, so you don't bother figuring out if it really does represent a discount. So this is an example of how actually in the real world our working memory might not be used how we think it would be used based on lab experiments. So when we use realistic stimuli, people won't always do what you think they will. They won't always compute the cost of a multi-buy if it becomes more difficult. They'll just give up and guess that it's a good option. So just to summarise my talk, I've shown that prefrontal and parietal regions play a really important role in integrating different types of information in working memory. And they seem to have different roles as well. So the prefrontal cortex seems to be involved in this executive control and sending biasing signals to domain-specific regions. And the parietal cortex seems to play more of a critical role in like integrating different types of information. Ongoing work that I've talked about is trying to understand working memory in more complex tasks like reasoning, and also realistic tasks that involve the kind of realistic decision making that we do in daily life. So I'm just going to acknowledge this suspect looking people, and thank you for this.
Thank you very much. I love this journey, by the way, from a bit of lab-based basic experimentation and working memory, and it gives you some sort of view, and you take it out in the real world, and something falls apart. I just think it's lovely. You know, if you don't look at the mind in its ecologically relevant context, what are you understanding? So, questions for
Let's just a short question regarding the last task. Did the participants have to buy the stuff in the end, or?
No, that would have been really mean because they spent loads.
So there was no consequence depending on the decision they made.
No consummatory act.
Say again?
No consummatory act.
Yeah.
No. They were told that they would be given a performance score. So they were given a performance score at the end of the experiment, and they were told that they would get a better score from basically choosing good offers and like buying a good range of stuff for this imaginary party. And actually, we did think about different ways of motivating them, like letting them save, like letting them keep the amount of money that they saved. But in the end, none of those were really feasible. But we actually found that people were pretty motivated because what was interesting about this study is that people would always come and say, "Oh, I'm really good at shopping. I always get all the best offers." And some people would come and say, "Oh, well, I'm no good at shopping. I never figure out what's good." But their perception of how good they were at choosing good versus bad kind of multiplier offers, it didn't really relate to their ability at all on the task. And they would actually come out thinking, some of them would come out thinking that they'd got all the best deals and they hadn't before. So yeah, they did seem to be quite motivated to perform the task.
Martin?
I was going to ask something related to that, because it's a bit like giving somebody a credit card versus, £100. And if there really were a penalty, you would wonder whether there'd actually be a bigger stress on working memory generally, so rather than just using, as you say, heuristics.
Yeah, that's true. I think it would be interesting to run some follow-up stuff. It is difficult to kind of work out those tasks and figure out how to do it, but it would be interesting if there was some penalty, like it got deducted from their overall payment for doing the experiment, if the amount they went over budget or something. Yeah, think about it.
In that last task, did you run a contrast between the trials where the choice was successful versus the trials where they weren't? Because you were suggesting that when they get to that higher than working memory, you just see them switching off. I wondered whether you could actually differentiate where they were successful versus where they weren't.
You mean successful by when they chose?
Where they chose advantageously, yeah. Because in that case, you can expect if it's beyond chance that they're employing working memory. So they would, in opposition to the idea that they're just giving up, is there any way of analysing in terms of success versus non-success?
Wait, I guess it's not really success, but you mean whether they actually bought the good offer. I did look at regions that were involved in buying good offers compared to not buying bad offers.
Yeah, or I mean, trials where they've given you a reasonable number of trials that you paid the data where they actually did buy bad offers. Did you do an analysis of where they did versus where they didn't?
Oh yeah, I have looked into that, but I think the problem was because there was such variability across subjects. That would mean that you'd have many more trials in some subjects than in others. Like it would be really imbalanced. So in some subjects they weren't very good, so there would be like almost equal numbers of trials where they chose badly and trials where they chose good. But in other subjects, it wouldn't be as easy to do that contrast. So yeah, I mean, I should look into it. I could maybe do it in some of them.
Yeah.
To some extent, there's seeing myself on the older end of your graph and being somebody who's looking like they're taking the heuristic route. and having from previous literature thought that wasn't, although I take what you say that this is kind of more lab-based literature, that working memory didn't decline until quite a lot older. I'm trying to think if there are any other.
Well, they were quite old actually.
But they were 40s and 50s?
No, the oldest was 74.
Okay, well that's comforting.
Can go shopping.
But the other point I think still remains in terms of the younger and the older participants. Were they similar in other respects?
Yeah, I think they were pretty similar. We didn't take any steps to really ensure that, but
in terms of, I was just wondering whether you had like a lot of undergraduate students as opposed to.
Yeah, not really. We tried to avoid that, and we tried to just recruit people from the same sources, so just like people from the community. Also, I think you often find that the kind of older people that volunteer for psychology experiments are often still have quite a high level of education, because that's why they're interested. But we didn't take any steps to actually assess that. I think actually it'd be interesting to look at it in a larger sample, because I think the problem was because this was an imaging experiment, we just didn't have that many people anyway. So it would actually be really interesting, like you say, to see at which point age really matters.
Steve?
Just one question about the second experiment, about alpha and IQ. I wondered, I saw you got Kameshi's name up there, I wonder if you looked at high frequency versus low frequency alpha, considered those type of analysis where you look at individualised alpha bands as opposed
to... do you mean for individual people, or do you mean just...
Yeah. It's about 3 bands of alpha if you really pin it down.
But do you mean it varies across individuals?
Yeah, but the reason I mention it is that you've got low and high alpha bands which can be split according to the individual. And I'm sure I've read a paper, but I can't think of what the reference is now, where the point where it splits increases with IQ. So it's actually, that point moves with IQ.
Okay.
So,
that might be, yeah.
So that's...
it could be interesting. I think I think there's a lot more stuff.
This would fit nicely.
Yeah, I think there's a lot more I can do with that data actually.
Yeah, it's interesting, but yeah,
that's not the really EEG data. I think.
You might get more sensitive stuff from the face stuff if you're looking at people's peak alpha rather than a broad band.
When you compared your multimodal imaging between MEG and fMRI and find the same areas activated, how do you explain, one's looking at milliseconds, one's looking at thousands of milliseconds, so the brain is doing, there's a shitload of synapses between one and the other, and yet the same areas. How do you explain
I think the reason is because fMRI measures blood flow, but it's used as a kind of proxy for neural activity. So there are papers showing that it's quite closely related. So
you would predict that EEG or MEG would give similar activation areas.
Yeah, there are papers on it, but what they tend to find is, like I've shown, high frequency stuff is often related to increases in bold, whereas in the lower frequencies, so lower frequency activity is often like desynchronization, so like decreases in power in the lower frequencies are related to increases in bold signal. But the opposite is true in the high frequencies, it's increases in power which are related to increases in bold. So there does seem to be some kind of relationship, but I don't think it's totally clear what it is, but there have been some things about it.
I think combine these imaging techniques and see what happens.
Yeah, they've done quite a bit of it in Cardiff.
Chris?
Yeah, he's done some of it, looking at combining the two.
Are there any other questions? I thought that was a good demonstration of pluripotency across many techniques, just some really good theoretical stuff. There is one.
I'm wondering, going back to your second analysis with the alpha band, and there is, the great difference, that like you do have a great difference between high and low on the progressive matrices. That one where you were relating the...
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Just like, those progressive matrices, I wonder if you rank them somehow, like in terms of difficulty, and then if you use that as a modulator in the high group, that you might find that efficiency increases as the difficulty increases.
Do you mean by the score? score, so if I rank them by their score on that.
Yeah, like rank the matrices on their score. And then at least then, you know, because it is a bit of an odd finding, like the hybrid being less efficient, but if it is, as you say, that it's just like almost a load effect thing, that it's at least if it was, you know, modulated by difficulty.
Yeah, I would think that actually.
Right, well, thank you very, very much, Helen.